Thank you, Helen. It's really exciting to be back in the Kreeger space and amongst the artists in the show, some from out of town who are just seeing the show for the first time, so it's special that we can all be here today. I'm Tomora, Wright, the curator of Perplexity, and I'm honored to have had the experience of curating the past 2 shows here at the Kreeger. Thank you to Helen and the team, Anna, Joanna, Ivan, and Natalie for making me feel at home. I keep telling them that I'm trying to stay here, but you know, we'll see how that goes. Thank you to Hamiltonian Artists Fellows and alumni for your creative vision and community for your explorational approach to the way we understand contemporary art today. Something these incredible artists have in common is they all went through the Hamiltonian Artists Fellowship Program. Hamiltonian Artists is a 501c3 located in DC that helps artists to develop important business skills, professional experiences, and visibility to support and sustain their art career. The fellowship accepts 5 fellows a year. It's a 2-year program. They're all incredible artists run by a wonderful team. Lily, Jonathan, and Anissa. Please support them, look them up, follow them on Instagram. They have exhibitions all year, and it's wonderful there. I first came up with the idea to do a show highlighting texture when I visited Glenstone and encountered Gunther Wecker's sculptural paintings. The optical illusions in his work made me think of other implied textures, symbolic textures in our textual experiences. And Perplexity asks us how our interventions in the world give materials new meanings and portrays the human impact on objects, materials, and environments we interact with daily. Texture is really a limitless space of discovery, as we see here today, presented by these fabulous artists. Let's give them all a hand. I'm going to let them speak and introduce themselves and let you know a little bit more about their practice.
Hi, I'm Sarah Knobel, and I'm coming from upstate New York. Extremely upstate, like I'm closer to the Canadian border than any other U.S. cities. So I teach at St. Lawrence University up there, and I'm a photography and video art professor, and that's my practice. That's what I do, and I've been there for 6 years, and have not lived in D.C. for 10 years. So it's really excited to be back and be in this space and see this show for the first time.
Hi, I'm Joyce Yu-Jean Lee. I also came from upstate New York, so I teach at Marist College in Poughkeepsie, New York, but I'm based in Manhattan. And I was in the Baltimore, DC area between 2008 to 2014 and used to teach at the Corcoran College. So I really miss being in DC, and it's great to see it back and thriving after COVID. I'm an assistant professor that teaches art and digital media, so digital practice is my primary focus. I make installations that question how the other is portrayed in mass media, using video projection, digital photography, and sculptural collage.
Hi, my name is Brian Michael Dunn. I came from here. Just on the border of DC, Maryland, and I am also an art teacher in DC Public Schools. I was a Hamiltonian Fellow between 2018 and 2020. My work, both sculpture and painting, are represented in the show, deal with translation of moments, materials, objects from everyday life, oftentimes a translation into a harder mechanical language of production. Thanks.
My name is Mike Iacovone. I live here in DC. Also a DC public school teacher. I teach graphic design in a magnet program here in DC. My work is, the work in this show anyway, is all done in the desert. I do big geometrical drawings in response to the space in the desert. And I take photos and video of the kind of performance of labor of making the drawings.
My name is Jerry Truong. My family originally came from Vietnam, but I was born in California, raised there, did my schooling in Southern California. I live in Silver Spring, pretty close to here, where I teach at the community college level. I teach digital media, photography, foundational art courses. And my work deals with history and memory and the residuals of trauma that comes from immigration. And lately I've been focusing on drawing, but I also do a lot of photography as well.
I am Amy Boone-McCreesh. I live in Baltimore, Maryland, and I also teach, rounding out I teach at Maryland Institute College of Art in Baltimore, although this year I'm visiting faculty at Dickinson College, which is a liberal arts school in Pennsylvania. And I work 2D, 3D, ideally as an installation artist, so creating a whole environment. And my work is under kind of a larger umbrella of the way that class and taste presents itself visually.
Wonderful. I hope you've all had a chance to see the show, but if not, make sure to stick around after and you can ask more questions of the artists. I'm going to ask individual questions of each of you first, and then maybe we can get into more group discussion. Sarah, could you talk about your process from consumption to collecting trash to staging and the smoke?
Okay. This work is actually older work from 2014 that's on display, and I think it's interesting you chose this work because I've been working with my trash and just like materials that we consume and kind of immediately use and discard afterwards since this time. So I really feel like that was a pivotal work for me. So it's kind of fun to show that because I haven't thought about it in a while. But yeah, a lot of it's my trash. I started collecting. Well, the one that's in the show, I don't know if everyone's seen it, that literally was me dumping out just my like weekly trash and kind of seeing it as like a landscape. So I wasn't really like collecting it necessarily to overanalyze like the textures and how they were going together. It was more like a spontaneous response to like looking at these materials and seeing how they can create a new landscape together. But some of the other processes were, as I started to do this, I started to collect more things that you're not even seeing maybe in some of these images, but some of the other images that are part of that series. So I started to like get a little neurotic of like, how many paper towels do I use a week? Or like starting to collect my laundry lint from the dryer and, you know, kind of just seeing like how we consume in this way that it's not always visually there. So it was really that starting point for me to be observing kind of the mundane and the personal, but also how these objects kind of have a life of their own and they have new relationships beyond just this small point, this temporary point where we're interacting with them. Yeah, so the series started in my own home, but I also did an art residency in Japan for a month. So that's where you see some of the other, you know, work coming through. But yeah, so it was kind of interesting when I was there. For my photos, I was starting to do still lifes a lot at that time, and a lot of it was me consuming things. So I loved to go to like the 100 yen dollar stores, and I loved the packaging, and I just was so fascinated with all that, and I would make these temporary sculptures with them, but I started realizing just what do I do with these materials afterwards, especially being in a culture that they have an amazing system of arranging their trash that I like was very foreign to me, so it started making me just aware of materials a lot. So even as I was making that work, I was putting my daily trash into plastic bags and then just documenting how they were melding and forming together and was becoming this like new resource, this new, not organic, but it kind of felt like they were organically meshing together. So I don't know if I answered all of the questions.
You did. Yeah, that's wonderful. Thank you for bringing us into your process and worlds. Yeah. Amy, could you say more about Flowers to the Gate and the title's significance?
Sure. So my piece that's hanging above the mantle in the back room over here is called Flowers in the Gate. And so I started using this. Oh, you actually can't see it from here. So that was misleading. Sorry. Just tap into your memory. So I've been working with this visual language of gates and bars. So I live in Baltimore, as I stated, and any of you that have experience living in a city have probably encountered these bars on your windows, right? and it's for safety, but it's also, there are different versions of them and different designs that have different levels of decoration. And I thought it was really interesting to use or lift that visual vocabulary of something that is meant for safety, but also we still want it to be beautiful. And the flowers are actually fake flowers, like real fake flowers that have been collaged into, into the piece, not rendered. And the reason for that is, fake flowers are this stand-in for something that is naturally very beautiful, but ultimately temporary. And depending on where you fall on your spectrum of how you encounter beauty or what you value, you might think that fake flowers are ugly or kitschy or gaudy or in poor taste. And so bringing in that visual vocabulary alongside the bars and asking these questions about, number one, what is beautiful and why do we all feel that way, and how is that dialed in specifically for each of us? And then number two, who has access to those things? So I started thinking a lot. I know it's happened to all of us.
Yeah.
Okay.
I've been doing that.
I might sit over here. Sorry.
I started thinking about a lot of these things before the pandemic, and then of course this was really heightened during the pandemic. So depending on if you had a yard, if you had a garden, some people living in New York are maybe looking at a brick wall, and that was what they had access to. So actually, the view you see out your window is a real indication of your class, or where you're falling in a certain social structure. And when you book a hotel, when you rent an apartment, you're always paying a premium for the view, right? Which is funny because the view is actually free, but the way that we control who has access to that thing is really loaded. And so creating this piece that could be in poor taste, but also deals with these ideas around beauty, but it presents very raw. That was how I kind of landed full circle with the title.
Yeah, and it fits in perfectly with the other classical works, but
yes.
Yeah, maybe we'll talk about that.
Okay, sure. Mike.
Either.
Okay. What is it like creating these large earth drawings, and how does that experience of existentialism and vastness shape how you view or exist in a metropolitan city like DC, and how does the contrast of each space influence your practice? I know you go out there like once a year, and you have all this time away from the metropolitan city as well, so I'm just curious.
Well, the actual physical process of making them is a lot of labor, and it's very hot, and it's very long days out in the desert, and it's usually June and July, so it's often 100 degrees or 110 degrees. But the process of making them is really more the planning. Like I work on the ideas for months and months and months during my academic year, and think about those things, because when I get out there, I want to be able to make the pieces without changing my mind or without making mistakes, because they take 4 or 5 or more days to make, and I don't want to get in there and say, oh, I did that wrong. So I have this, while I go out there for a few weeks, sometimes 2 or 3 weeks each summer, that's not that long. And even though I'm working maybe 12 or 14 or 16 hours a day, it's just not that long. So the process is a very long process to come up with. There's just tons and tons of notes and drawings and trying to figure everything out to make sure I get it right in the moment. And then the actual physical part of making the piece is really the performance. So it's rehearsed in a lot of ways on paper. And so I just have to go out there and kind of follow my own directions. And it's this very it's really intense labor. It's as close to like meditating as I can imagine, as someone who's super uptight and could never meditate. So it's like the reward for like the work. So I feel like the real work is coming up with the ideas, and then like the sweaty, back-breaking labor is like the easy part, kind of. And being out there is just amazing, because I love living in DC, and a lot of my work before I started doing this was about being in DC and about experiencing the spaces of the city and when you really think about living in a city, there really is very little public space. Almost everything is owned and private, so you have sidewalks and parks and not much else. You know, anything else, you can, the doors can lock and you can get kicked out, like you don't have access to those things. So my work is very much about how do we experience public space in a city and how do we navigate those spaces, and based on different reasons why we navigate those spaces. And then all of a sudden being out in the desert, it's just this like overwhelming feeling of bigness and smallness at the same time. Where the places I do this, I mean, I could see for miles and miles and miles. Like nobody can sneak up on you out there. You know, it's just completely flat, I'm completely alone, and you just have this big space. And the first time I went out there, I was like, oh, it's like this big void. Like the salt flats, which is where I do these, it's like a big white piece of paper. And like, oh, what could I do? And then so I think this past year is the 7th year in a row I've gone out to work, and they just keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And I think this past year I got to a point where I went too big, because I made something so big that I couldn't photograph it anymore. Because when I would put my drone in the air, it would have to get so high that the drawing would disappear. So that was like, I was like, oh, I finally went too far. So it's a real contrast to living in like the urban DC, and I love living in the city, and I love walking around and all that, but I also love getting out there and being totally alone with that work.
DC is also a place where you can't have drones.
You're not allowed to fly,
Yeah. So that's also interesting too. Brian, could you talk about the real and depicted reality you portray through your sculpture practice and how that informs your painting practice?
Absolutely. My sculpture, one on view here is the towel piece at the bottom of the steps. And this whole series of work, I'm interested in translating objects, often intimate, typically ephemeral, into sheet metal, painted steel, for a few reasons. One, highlighting some of the functional aspects, transforming them into paint, kind of in a hopefully tongue-in-cheek reference to geometric abstraction in our recent history of painting. So like, it was amazing to see the Gene Davis painting downstairs, and I'm thinking about a lot of this type of work where he's interested in reality in that work, and in one way of the paint being and the mark being real, and I'm hoping to lift some of that and put it back in service of an experience of the sculpture, both of the paint and the steel being a real experience of the real material, but then also referencing another aspect of our reality through replication. So my hope for your experience of the sculpture is like you're holding both in your mind at the same time, or maybe oscillating between two understandings of, I know this is obviously metal and paint is clearly, but also all these signifiers that are reading as soft or blue or towel, and so that hopefully these those two readings are sort of oscillating back and forth and holding you in a sort of unease or complicating the experience of it for a viewer. For my paintings, is kind of the opposite direction that I work, where I'm starting with a whole language of forms, geometric forms that I have created, that I find. Some is taken from packaging or the language of photo reproduction or image reproduction, and using these production-focused forms to try and invent a space, a sort of alternate reality. And so my hope for the painting is that these forms that may be symbolic at the onset, or initially, like a symbol for a leaf or a symbol for rain, a very geometric sort of pared down symbol, can be reintegrated into a cohesive space in the painting that actually feels like a specific environment or a specific experience of rain. with the sculpture work, so we have a towel here. I've done pieces, installation of newspapers, things like a giant blue construction tarp, vinyl record jackets, things that might be found at hand, and a lot of times they're installed in contexts that are both proper to a painting or a sculpture, and then also to the thing itself. So like the records are often installed maybe just leaning against the shelf or the wall. This piece is on the floor. Some of the towels are upright, but yeah, I guess that also the installation, I'm hoping to aid sort of that that bothness in one's encounter. So at Hamiltonian 2020, I was excited to install some of these sculptures of newspapers that are stripped of the text and reduced to just the color block of the photos and the format of the layout, installed throughout the storefront window. I don't know if you've been to the Hamiltonian Gallery, but it's a storefront right on 14th Street, and as though it was like a papered window, of a closed down shop or maybe undergoing some renovations. So.
Yeah, I really like how you described your sculpture and oscillating between the experience of seeing texture, touching it, and hearing it. They let us know if it's like safe or if it's not safe, and how the perception can be skewed and how we kind of play between what we understand in that way. So I always like the way that you talk about your sculpture. So thank you. Jerry, why did you choose Claude Monet's Meadow at the Gaverny painting to sit adjacent to your two works? I want to make sure I say it right, Truong.
Oh, Dunn?
Dunn.
Yeah, which is Vietnamese for, well, you can translate several different ways, but it means from the water or from the motherland. So the two pieces that I have in the exhibition are landscape drawings that represent spaces that my parents had to struggle to cross over to be able to escape from Vietnam. So like on one wall, the panels depict like the beach with this line right through the center where the tide is sort of flowing in. And that represents my mom and how she tried to flee with her young siblings. And so what they had to do is they had to at one point run through a jungle and try to get to the beach where there was a boat that was waiting for them to try to take them away. Unfortunately, the first time they tried to escape, one of my aunts, who was a little girl, got snatched, and so they all had to go back and then try again. And eventually they decided to split up the family because they couldn't all make that escape. And so for me, that space from going from land to water was a boundary that her side, they couldn't cross over. The other panel on the other side, facing that piece, represents my dad's journey. So my dad was also a boat person who fled Vietnam by boat. And he escaped with two of his older brothers. And one of his brothers fell into the ocean and he disappeared, so he drowned. And so for me, for him, the boundary between water and air was one that he couldn't cross over. And so when I was thinking about landscapes and I was thinking about the horizon and then these boundaries, I wanted to create these two pairs of drawings that where there's this very defined line that goes right through them. And so when we're discussing the installation, that space where my pieces are is really interesting because there are three walls and there's this empty wall that we wanted to have a piece there. And so Tomora and I, we had a conversation, we were just discussing, what are some possibilities? And I was just thinking, okay, so these are landscape drawings. It might be good to have a landscape painting in that spot. And we discussed it with Helen, the director of the Kreeger, and she just sort of cheerfully just mentioned, we have a Claude Monet available. Claude Monet, okay. And so we looked at, there were actually a couple of options, but the one that we looked at was just so perfect because it was just this painting that had a line right through the center And it was a landscape drawing of like the ground and then the air. So we were thinking about this like loop, right? So, you know, land to water, water to air, and then he just closed that loop. And then that painting too is just like, there's something about the way that, you know, he used the paint and the color was just so delicate that it just worked with like the monochromatic drawings that I had.
And that piece actually, the Claude Monet's piece actually disappears amongst your really large works. So that's also something that I love to see in that space. Yeah, thank you. Joyce, you presented the piece in the show at the Delaware Contemporary in an exhibition. Could you tell us more about the immersive experience and all of the works that you presented there in conversation with each other?
Sure. So I had a solo show at the Delaware Contemporary, which is in Wilmington. If you've ever had the chance to go, you just take the Amtrak to the Wilmington stop and walk to the museum in like 5 minutes. I really encourage you to see it. There's like a great glass show that's up right now through the end of the year. But so the work is very fresh, and I'm just like still formulating all my words on how to describe it, but hearing y'all talk, I'm going to pick up on some of those notes. So the show was entitled Mesophotic Sanctuary, and the Mesophotic Zone is a newly discovered zone in the Polynesian seas, but it's a level that exists in every ocean. That is not the top layer of the ocean that receives a lot of sunlight where coral reefs grow. It's the level right below it. The deepest part of the ocean gets no sunlight, and there's like exotic creatures that have lights that live down there, right? But the middle zone is this area where there's not enough sunlight permeation, and there has never been coral discovered there. But in November of 2021, some French scientists discovered in the Mesophotic zone off of the coast, or in the Polynesian seas, off the coast of Tahiti, new coral reefs. And they, you should Google it when you go home because they're so amazing. They are like, I mean, I don't want to hit you up, they're huge, and they look like giant rose cabbages. And they have, the scientists don't even understand what kind of ecosystems they're supporting, but it's a really exciting discovery. Exciting because our oceans are acidifying due to climate change. Coral bleaching is happening due to sea level rise and the temperatures increasing in the water. And so one of my life dreams has always been to go to the Great Barrier Reef, but like half of it's gone already, half of it's done. So the curator at, all that to say, the curator at the Delaware Contemporary invited all of the artists during their summer season to propose a show about play. And that summer was the same summer that all of the Russian oligarchs' yachts were being confiscated due to the Ukrainian-Russian war. And so I was thinking about the idea of play and how it's extremely classist, right? So my favorite activity to do in the whole world, my happy place, is to snorkel. And I've only done it like a couple times in my life. But I recently got married during COVID, and my partner and I, Joseph, we went to Tahiti to snorkel. And so I had just heard about this discovery of the Mesophotic zone, and we didn't get to go that deep, obviously, because I don't scuba dive, but we got to see some parts of the Polynesian seas that were very pristine, not touched by, you know, a lot of tourists, and it was really exciting. But generally speaking, our leisure from our wealthiest classes who can afford these kinds of recreational activities and play in the ocean with their, you know, $400 million yacht that has a viewing portal for their guests in the bottom of the boat to see the ocean floor, like these types of recreational vehicles are not helping global warming and climate change. And so I was thinking about what does it mean that there's this new middle light zone discovered in the world, and certain classes of people get to play in it and other people don't. And so I created an installation that had 3 video installations. A big pile of sand in the middle of the gallery where I projected an imaginary coral reef with photographs that I took of Polynesian plants and flowers and fruits, and a couple of snapshots of different fish and coral that we got underwater, and I collaged them into an imaginary marine landscape of what it would be like if every normal person in the world had the privilege of visiting the Mesophotic zone. What would this sanctuary look like? What will scientists discover in the future despite climate change? And how will Mother Nature use its adaptive technologies to thrive despite what humans are doing to our ecosystem. And so the coral reef was in the center, anchored on sand, and then I had 2 projections on the opposing walls. One was my imaginary yacht portal, so it's this like giant 16-foot oval projection of what normal people could see if we could all visit the mesophotic zone in the future. And then on the opposite wall, I had a series of glass sculptures. So I did a commission in Alexandria, Virginia a couple years ago where I got to work with some glass artists and make a glass disc where we projected an animation I made of 3D water. And so I have all these small prototypes of these beautiful handmade, hand-blown glass discs. These artists like blow through a pipe and it becomes a glass bubble, and then you pierce a hole at the end of it and you spin the tube really fast and they flare out. And it's like the basic structure of building a glass plate, and it's called a rondelle. So I have all these little rondelles left, and I created this custom mounting system to line them up on the wall in a diagonal and then project footage of the surface of the Polynesian Ocean that I captured during our trip onto the glass. So it created reflections of light that referenced the mesophotic middle light. And so in addition to that, I created some sculptures. So the piece you see here is called Reflections of Taha'a, which is an island that we visited where vanilla plantations are still grown by family farmers, where every seed has to be pollinated by hand when the orchids bloom for 24 hours. And that's where Tahitian vanilla comes from. And I photographed the water at night where there were some fish swimming around because there was an interesting reflection off of the sand and the lights of the hotel on the water. And I printed it onto aluminum because I'm interested in trying to take the way I play with video installation and the interaction with light on glass and try to capture that in sculpture. And so there's some reflection of like gold through the aluminum that you see through the UV print. And then I also cut out some little inset shapes that reference water reflections and put in gold mirrors. And the idea with those little cutouts is as you're looking at this piece and looking at something that looks mysterious and will hopefully evoke some thoughts about water life and marine mystery, you see little cropped out pieces of your own face in the landscape. And the idea is, when I think about climate change and I think about the other that we don't get to hear a lot about, I think about how everything in mass media and the news cycle is like this doomsday Armageddon news about climate change, which is all true, unfortunately. But this news about this discovery about the mesophotic zone got buried in all the other news cycle that was happening in November. And I wanted to highlight that and show viewers that we are all implicated in caring for our planet. Our face is the face of change, and how as an artist I can inspire people to care about our environment without using shame or guilt, but instead reflecting on beauty and hope.
Thank you for that description. I was feeling like a deep sense of FOMO for not being able to see that show. So I just look at it online all the time. I'm like, I wish I was there. But I love the ocean. So thank you for speaking more about that. So Perplexity is, as you can hear, this complicated relationship, having so many different experiences with textures, from what it appears to be to what it actually is and what it becomes once we touch it. It becomes something new. I'm also interested in the words we use to describe certain textures and how that shapes the way we interact with them. The artists in the show are so successful at giving these textures new meaning through the many ways they manipulate them. Could you all share more about your relationship with the textures you use in your work and how you give them new meanings?
I got it on the tip of my brain, I can start. So as I mentioned before, I use just one area where I'm using real objects are the fake flowers, and my work is very collage forward or collage heavy, although I'm really inspired by abstract painting. But I think there's a real difference between rendering something versus presenting an object. And so when you're talking about this with your paintings, Brian, it was making me think a lot about, what does it mean to present something that is inspired by reality versus that reality? So the texture of the fake flowers and the found fabric and things like this are bringing along a history, whether it's our own associations or if it's a physical history. And I think in repurposing those actual objects and creating physical texture, it's a little more raw and it can live outside of just the history of painting and rendering something that is real. Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure.
Jerry, could you talk about the invisible texture that people might not really know about?
So to be able to create the images on the panels, it's a combination of charcoal, which I use to render light and shadow to create the illusion of texture. But then I'm also playing with different materials. So mixed in with the charcoal is incense ash that I collected from a Vietnamese altar. So Vietnamese people we're very connected to our ancestors, and when people pass, we'll usually set up an altar in our home, and we'll burn incense. Just whenever you want to sort of remember the people that passed, or when they're holidays or important ceremonies. And so I wanted that ceremonial, that commemoration that comes from that practice that we as Vietnamese people do. And so I mixed that in. So the material is incredibly delicate. And so it's you have to work with it very carefully. So it's this combination of rough and then light and gentle.
I was just thinking, in my paintings recently, I'm increasingly interested in a visual texture that I can achieve through successive layering of lots of information in an image. So I've been looking at and thinking about a lot of textiles and weaving work, and trying to find a way in the painting to create an image or a scene that through all these layers is also almost interwoven or becomes woven, and how that texture can obliterate the image while also sort of accumulating an image. So yeah, that's a different type of texture.
Yeah.
I've been thinking about.
Go ahead.
Okay, I'll ask the next question. How does presenting the works in a show alongside other contemporary works differ or offer a new perspective on seeing a conversation with older works? So, or amongst all these classical artists that we've talked about throughout, all of our learning in school about art, and now your work's standing next to them. What is that experience like? And I know me and Amy have talked about the still lives so much. But yeah, I just want to know your take on that and how it's brought a new conversation.
I mean, for me, it's kind of a cheap thrill.
Me too.
Yeah, I mean, this place is full of the artists that we studied in school,
Yeah.
and maybe had to write about, and maybe came to see these things and all that, and that feels great to be in the same place as them. Almost too great, kind of. Almost I don't know if I deserve that kind of thing. But I mean, these are all from the past, and we're all contemporary artists, and the world is very different, and we're dealing with the world very differently.
Absolutely.
But it's it's really cool to shuffle the deck like that and be next to them.
I can add, since we were just talking about it, so the room where my work is located is primarily floral still lives, and there's a really long history of floral still lives as being kind of the pinnacle of beauty and access. And earlier, a few of us were talking about Dutch still life paintings, so think about 1700s with those really black backgrounds, and it was really kind of like a flex or a brag about having access to fresh flowers, or the rabbit, or fresh fruit. And food is also really kind of divisive, right? So affirming and wonderful and fulfilling to be in this room with this long history floral still lifes, which are actually kind of talking about what is beauty, essentially, right? And preserving that. It's amazing.
I have some thoughts, I guess, about the center room where my piece is in the corner. A lot of these are impressionist landscapes in the center room, right, where these painters were obsessed with trying to capture and break down the visual quality of capturing paint and light and color with little dots, right, deconstructed dots to form a landscape. And it was all about exploring the qualities of light. And so it's interesting to see how that was done long ago with oil paint and be in, trying to do that as a contemporary artist with totally different materials. So through digital photography, through a UV printing process, which is like, ink sprayed down and cured with a UV light onto an industrial material like aluminum dye bond. But really, I'm exploring the same thing that these artists long ago were doing, that the Monet I'm next to, and some of these other paintings are trying to do, is I'm trying to capture that quality of light. And there's something like my interest in digital photography is not making a perfect photo. It's revealing kind of the dots of like each pixel, showing the dot of the way the ink is laid down on a shiny surface, and letting the bumpy texture of that metal like make the light that hits each little dot refract, And so it's interesting to think about that parallel with material, even though I'm using photography and sculpture.
Yeah.
And then so I think maybe you pointed it out, Brian, like I don't remember who wrote me on Instagram about is this a Henry Moore sculpture that's outside? That's next to my work, like the silhouette of my piece. I'm thinking about like a body of water, but this is a human body, and seeing those like curvilinear lines echo through the window was a really interesting moment. I don't remember who.
Yeah, that was me. I was going to say, seeing all of your work in this museum, it's so exciting. It's really reinvigorated. I mean, not that it needs it, but a lot of the historical artwork, and in seeing contemporary work alongside helps me to look at these paintings and work from the past in the present, like in the present moment, and alongside our ideas that we're carrying in the present. So seeing the biomorphic sculpture next to your piece, a lot of these linkages that start to happen. So
it's like a treasure hunt to see all the visual connections and conceptual connections.
Definitely. Yeah, the contemporary works, like you said, bring these classical works to life, for sure, and into this world and what we're talking about. So, any more comments? Well, I want to open up the floor for Q&A, and if you have questions for each other as well that I haven't really tapped into, please feel free to ask each other.
I have one for Sarah. Excuse me. I was curious about, it's intentional that you use your own trash as opposed to, that's a statement, instead of using like trash that you found. Obviously it's different when you've got your own. And I was curious, the way I interpreted it a little bit was like, it's kind of like a journal. It's just like a log of what you're keeping, obviously, like throughout the day or throughout multiple days. And I was curious how you would describe that. Like the way I saw it was not exactly confronting what you keep, and it's the way I think of those things is kind of like normally for all of us, we consume and then we discard it, and it's kind of like out of sight, out of mind. It's like gone. But through your work, you were I sound out of breath, slightly nervous, but you kept it, and for us we just consume, discard, and it's gone. But it's not, it stays and it lingers, it goes somewhere, it doesn't disappear and vanish into thin air, but your work obviously I think is sort of a commentary on that.
Yeah.
But for you I wanted to.
And I've been saving, I feel like a hoarder. I've been saving my own trash for a long time. So the work is really developed, but it's interesting because I feel like that work is more autobiographical than my newer work, because I think that was where I immediately was coming from, like directly looking at myself. And what's really interesting is when I was at Hamiltonian and years before that, I did self-portraits. That's all I did. I mean, probably most of the people know me here from doing self-portraits, so it would seem like a huge shift. But I think for that, it was then I started looking at myself by how I was consuming and through objects. So it really has shifted, even though I'm using the same materials, where now I'm probably like removing that human quality out of it. Not almost completely, but sometimes people can't tell what it is anymore, even though it's coming from my trash. So I feel like that was just that first moment where I was really starting to realize those things and just like what these objects represent of me. And I was really making work too that I started realizing I was buying a lot of the crap that I was like kind of, that I would go to like party stores and I lived for the like bright, shiny stuff, and I was like realizing I'm not really doing what I'm saying, It was like this moment where I really decided I needed to stop doing that and just look at how I was consuming in general.
I was actually going to ask you that, if that changed the way of you consuming, like if you started to consume less because of the awareness, or the opposite, you started to consume more thinking, oh, I'm going to use that after
right.
I trash it.
I made that work 8 years later, and now, like, you can ask my husband, I'm really neurotic, but it's not like I can get away from it. Like, it's not like I can go to a store and be like, oh, I'm not going to buy produce that's wrapped in plastic packaging. I feel like you can't get away from it. But it's made me more aware of, like, well, what do I need and what do I not need? I have to say where I live now, too, has probably changed. I used to live in D.C., and I'm slowly getting more and more rural. Now I live like near the Adirondacks, where there's like nothing to do. Like, the only store is like a Walmart. So I feel like I overanalyze everything now. Like now I'm getting more worried, which is kind of, and getting more neurotic. But I don't know. There's like the thing, you can't get away from it. You can't get away from it at the same time. So I don't know. Like sometimes I wonder if like my message is. And this is one thing I was going to ask Joyce too, like the positive and negative, like there's beauty in it, but then there's also like, how can we resolve this? And I feel like that's always something that slightly tortures me. But yeah.
I wanted to add to that, so you're staging your trash, you're looking at it, but then you add these like exhaust, these like fumes of color, which is like an illustration of like, the smell that it could have, and like
kind of toxic.
Exactly, toxicity. So that's like another way.
And I really like to use bright colors, not only to like allure people in, almost like beautiful like products, photography, but also to kind of throw you off a little bit, like make you uncomfortable with it. After you think it's beautiful, I hope people walk by like, oh, that doesn't feel right. That's a little uncomfortable, or so I wanted to kind of play with those overhyped, like a sunset, like that's what I reference a lot in my work now with like radiance. Like I want like the most beautiful sunsets are usually like representing like just the toxic air that we're around. So.
And I could touch a little bit on your question about like the positive, negative aspects.
Right.
So like I used to work in advertising, so a lot of my work is formed by my interest in media and news. And the media landscape is not a very encouraging one.
Yeah.
And it seems to be increasingly more and more sensationalist and negative. And I mean, we're in DC in the heart of like political journalism, which is, I think, obsessed with listening to, and probably isn't the best for my mental health. But all that to say, I think because we live in a society of really rapidly changing images and news cycles, like as artists, we have to be very realistic about how to capture people's attention. How do we arrest them out of whatever they're doing and make them stop and look? And so beauty is something really important.
Right.
And I think that there is a way that as visual content producers, we can think about using that to bring attention to important issues. And that's what I always try to do with my work, is like, even though I might be like, trying to cover global climate change, like, if I can capture somebody's attention and get them to look like, because they're vain and they love taking selfies and see a picture of their face in the mirror in my collage, like, if that works, like, I'm not above using those methods, right? But then once I capture their attention, I think that's where the different messaging needs to come in. And so as an artist, I'm always thinking about, like, how can I use beauty in a way that is kind of subversive and unexpected?
Thanks for sharing everything you did. All of you are teachers. I'm curious to know what the relationship is, if there is one, between your teaching and your practice, and your practice and your teaching.
I can start this, I think. I think as an artist, and probably all of us here, and actually everyone hanging in this museum, I think that our role is to ask questions of the world around us, like constantly reassess. And I think as a teacher, whether you're teaching art or something else, you're encouraging others to think critically and ask questions of the world around you. So I think at a really base, like fundamental level, that is always informing my own practice and what I'm encouraging students to do. And asking those questions like manifests in different ways based on your interests and what you've gone through in your life and the things you're attracted to. So I think that's like a really broad, obviously a really broad way to answer that question, but I always think it's really, really interesting to think that even these people are asking questions, whether it's about motion or color. Yeah, it's really great. It's really universal, which I find, of course, there are all these specific ways that it probably informs our personal practices, but that's how I would answer that question. What ages do you teach?
I teach high school.
High school? And
I teach elementary school.
Ooh. I'd be curious to hear. Yeah, I'm curious to hear that from you too.
Well, Amy, I couldn't put it better than your answer. I mean, honestly, like the teaching for me, it is all about asking them questions and getting them to do the work of the thinking, not just telling them.
Yeah, the answer.
And, I don't know how much directly influenced, but I am definitely inspired and amazed at what kids just do naturally. Working with the younger age group, like before developing self-consciousness about what they're making, and some really interesting decisions happen that may seep in from time to time. So.
Before they're scared of the judgment.
Or decided I can't, or
Yeah.
it doesn't look exactly like this other thing.
Yeah.
So that's thrilling.
I mean, for me, it's a lot of my job is crowd control because it is high school. But I mean, the investigation is always the important part to me, and to show them like you can always go further, and like you can always like continue the conversation, and whatever you found out, like what's next. And for me, that's the interesting thing, and when I can see the kids do that, and when they finish something, almost all the time, they're like, it's done and it's gone. But if you can get them to think about, well, what's next? And I think that that's always been a very important part of being an artist, is like not finishing.
Yeah,
Is to like keep your investigation going. And any of the things in my life as an artist that I ever felt were finished, like the door's shut and it's gone and I never go back. So like I don't want things to be finished. I want to keep investigating and keep digging and keep going. And I feel like when something has that finished feeling, that I did something wrong. So like I like to keep pushing my students that way. And some of them really get into it and a lot of them don't. But it's kind of interesting to see where they go.
You might not even know the impact you're having though, even if they don't, right?
Oh yeah, most of the
never
impact
know.
you
Yeah.
will probably never see.
Thank you for being our teachers.
Yes, absolutely. We have time for one more question. Yeah.
We had a wonderful discussion about how your pieces beautifully fit into the space and complemented all pieces existing already in the space. So I was thinking, as an artist, do you ever imagine the space your work is going to be presented, and does it influence the way you make the work, maybe the size, the material, or you always think about your work like a standalone piece that can fit anywhere? And conversely, when you install the piece in different environments, do you change things? Do you change maybe the orientation, like the spacing, to create new meanings and kind of more fitting within the new space?
I just want to comment on Amy's piece. We took the glass out.
Oh, that's right. Yes.
We took the glass out of her piece because it had a glare.
Yes.
And it actually gave more access to the texture of the paper and the overlapping, and then also spoke to the axis of the other paintings next to it. So I think that's a really interesting question.
Oh, that's a good question.
And then we're also in a space where we're taking down all of these classical, this is my favorite part about the installation. We're taking down the Monets, the Manets, and moving them around. It's like, bye-bye, we're putting up these beautiful new contemporary artworks, you know? Like, that's the best part. So again, thinking about space, that's my favorite part of curating the show. But go ahead.
I mean, I think as contemporary artists, we have to consider context, and I think probably all of us talked about not just our pieces, but where we are and what's going on, and I think that's maybe the most important part as a contemporary artist. But as far as, for me, making the work, I'm never thinking about where it's going to go. It's honestly, my work is out in the desert, and then the stuff that's on the wall is just the artifact. It's just a record of the work, so it's essentially a performance that nobody gets to see. And I'm fine with that. So for me, the aftermath is like, hang it up, print it, put it wherever you want it. I don't really care. I want to make it as big as possible, and that it kind of ends there. So I don't have any. I'm not sentimental about putting it up or any of those things. So it's very. I probably have a very different answer than anyone else here would have, because I don't find the actual photos on the wall or the videos that I make to be precious. They're like, they're the aftermath and the artifact. So everything's already removed from the context of the desert, so whatever the new context is not that important to me.
Wow, that's so interesting, because I think my brain works the exact opposite way.
Yeah, probably most people.
Especially your work.
Yeah, because I'm an
installation.
installation, exactly. So I actually can't make my work until I see the site. So I'm not the kind of artist that just makes work in the studio to make work. Like I know, like I've always been so jealous of painters who can just like have a stack of canvases and just like go at it. I need to know a site, and then I formulate my concept for the show around the site. And these sculptures are actually the first time I've diverged away from that in a very long time, because it's really exhausting to travel around and see a lot of sites to make work for. And so now I kind of just want to say, okay, I'm going to focus on the object and where it gets placed. I don't want that to be so much of a consideration, because I'm tired of traveling, and I just want to like be in my studio and think about what's in front of me there, and that's it. So it's a really new way of thinking that I'm not used to. Yeah, but I'm probably the opposite of you.
That sounds right.
Yeah.
And Amy, like when we showed together, you like painted all the walls.
Yes.
I mean, so I feel like installations.
Yes. I think I fall between the two of you. Yeah, if I'm doing a site-specific installation, obviously I'm planning for that space, but I think in terms of logistics, you don't always have the luxury or the time to create a work for a specific space. It's often a curator or someone will invite you to be in a show, and that show is at this kind of predetermined location, and then sometimes you're working it backwards, and you have new ideas about your work based on that space. So yeah, it's pretty interesting.
Thank you all so much. This has been wonderful. Thank you so much for hanging out. Shows in the Kreeger space through the collaborative initiative, and seeing more contemporary works in conversation with these classical works. This conversation needs to continue, and we've had so many new discoveries and new communities getting together, and the Ham Fam, which is what we call us. It's been wonderful doing this with you all, so thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you.